Welcome to the webinar. I'm Lizzie Sagoo, President-elect of the British Society of Soil Science, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to our second webinar of the year. Before I welcome our presenters today, I'd just like to introduce the British Society of Soil Science as hosts of today's webinar. We're an established international membership organisation and charity committed to the study of soil in its widest aspects. We bring together those working within academia and have a growing membership amongst practitioners implementing soil science in industry and those with a keen interest in soils. So we plan to host 10 webinars during 2025, so keep an eye out on our website for further details. Before we begin today, just some basic housekeeping. As there's so many of you here today, all your microphones have been muted. We will be taking questions during and at the end of the presentations, so we'll be monitoring these throughout the webinar. So please can you make sure that you submit any questions for the speakers by 12:50 to allow us to get through as many as we can. Although you'll see that there is a raise your hand button, we won't be using this unless the presenter specifically asks for a show of hands. The presentations today have been awarded BASIS and Neuroso CPD points. So if you are registered with either body, please contact us up directly after the event. And finally, please be aware that we're recording today's presentation. I'd like to quickly introduce our corporate member, ADAS. ADAS is one of the UK's leading agricultural and environmental R&D and consultancy businesses, with about 450 staff based across the UK, working in a range of disciplines, including soil science. Both of our speakers today are from the ADAS Soils Research Group and will be presenting on the topic of grassland soil health. Our first speaker is Dr. Paul Newell-Price. Paul is Head of Soils and Nutrients at ADAS. He's a soil scientist, a chartered scientist and a fellow of the British Society of Soil Science, with over 30 years of research and advisory experience working on the interactions between land management practices and ecosystem service delivery in the UK and overseas. Paul joined ADAS in 2005 and was scientific coordinator for the Horizon 2020 Super G project on sustainable permanent grassland systems and policies. Paul will discuss the challenges and various options for managing grasslands for soil health and how this interacts with the delivery of multiple ecosystem services, including results from Defra and EU-funded projects from the past 15 years. So over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Lizzie. Good afternoon, everybody. Great, okay. So in terms of what I want to cover today, focus on managing grasslands, but I want to focus on, first of all, what we mean by soil health and linking through to provision of ecosystem services. We'll be looking at a bit more detail in terms of soil properties, how that relates to soil health, and how we can manage soils to improve their health, their properties, and the delivery of various functions. And then it'll be a focus on grassland management. So the idea is really to set the scene for John's later talk on the mob grazing project and other work we've done around sort of grazing practices, how that influences things. So this is more as an overview. So I'll introduce the options, various options in terms of managing grasslands, so how we manage them, how we can alter things. Look at the impact of that management, because it can be challenging to manage grasslands sustainably or for a range of ecosystem services. I'll touch upon their condition in terms of national scale, so England and Wales, proportion of soils in good condition, that sort of thing. And then a little bit about mitigation, just touching upon that in terms of the sorts of things that are available to farmers and that farmers do to sort of mitigate sort of poor condition. And then I'll touch upon at the end this sort of question of trying to deliver multiple ecosystem services, trying to deliver multifunctionality from grasslands, and then just a few conclusions. So if we're talking about grassland management and delivering soil health, what do we mean by soil health? And we think this is quite a useful definition. So soil health is the ability of a soil to act as a living system to sustain in the long term its most important function. So I think the key point here is on soil being a living system. So it's not only soil chemical properties, but physical properties, but it's also biological. and it's linked through to soil functions, so the ability of soils to produce biomass, support crop yield, but also allow soils to drain, regulate water flows, regulate air flows, and also store carbon, things like that. So the soil functions feed through to the soil ecosystem services and to the wider ecosystem services that you can see on the right-hand side of the slide there. So what we want from soils will depend on the context in terms of what the priorities are in terms of its functions and the ecosystem services that it delivers. So that feeds through to the soil properties. So as I mentioned, we've got, in terms of soil health and defining the soil health, it is an integration of the physical, the chemical, and the biological. And they are integrated, they're interrelated. So in terms of the physical properties, if we compress the soil, if we smear it, if we reduce the pore space, then there's less space for the biology, the fungal hyphae, the roots, and for other soil organisms to explore through the soil. We can also affect things through the chemical, so pH, things like pH and the amount of nutrient input can drive what biology exists within the soil. So we know that those are two very sort of interrelated factors. So in terms of soil properties, we have our inherent properties. So that sort of sets the context. And I'll just show us a map here which sort of illustrates the range of different soil types, those sort of inherent soil types, so the soil texture, soil depth, but also soil drainage, very important. And this map just shows really the variation in terms of topsoil texture and depth. We also need to think about the full soil profile, because it's a three-dimensional system. So not only the topsoil, but how is the subsoil behaving? What are its properties, and what's its condition? So those are the inherent properties that we're working, which we can sort of change the inherent properties to some degree through management. And those are what we call the sort of dynamic properties. So a whole range of management practices that we can use to change those dynamic properties, which you can see there, and some of which we can use within grassland systems. So just focusing on, given that soil is a living system, I just want to focus on the biology for a minute. So just thinking about how important the soil biology in terms of soil functions. We need that biology to work in terms of improving nutrient cycling, but also decomposition of organic materials that are added to land, crop residues, or anything else that's about. And this slide, I think, is a useful one in terms of illustrating the different trophic levels. So we've got the bacteria, we've got the fungi. We know that that fungi bacterial ratio is affected by management, things like pH and nitrogen addition. But you'll see as we move from left to right in the slide, we have the different trophic levels within that food web. So we go from the yellow to the blue. You can read the different organisms we've got there, through to the red, the sort of predatory organisms, and then through to the soil-dwelling high level predators. And the food web, the range of organisms that we have in the soil are driven by, to a certain extent, inherent properties, but also those dynamic properties that we can alter through management. And you'll see here we've also got earthworms, which are a key organism in the soil, not only as an indicator, but as a key ecosystem engineer, because they actually alter the environment of the soil quite significantly. So just to focus on that for a moment, we often use earthworms as an indicator of soil health. They are sensitive to pH, they're sensitive to waterlogging, compaction, tillage, organic matter management, and it's one of the organisms that's used in sort of national scale soil monitoring. We can not only look at total numbers of earthworms and their biomass, but also split them into different ecotypes. So we've got the epigeic, which are the sort of litter surface dwellers, the endogeic, the topsoil dwellers, and then an E6, the deep burrowers, which create those deep channels which help with aeration and drainage So as I say, key ecosystem service engineer. So bear that in mind when I'm presenting some of the results of mitigation later on. So moving on to grassland management itself then, having set the scene in terms of soil health, soil properties and indicators and biology, what can we do with grassland in terms of the way we manage it? And this is just a couple of slides which were developed by a couple of the partners from the Horizon 2020 Super G project, which is on sustainable permanent grassland systems. So developed by Stanislav Hajduk and Dario Sacco. So yeah, various ways that we can use grasslands in terms of cutting or grazing, various other uses. We can alter the way we defoliate the soil, so how many cuts or grazings per year, when we graze it, when we cut it. So are we focusing on a summer grazing season, or are we looking to extend the grazing into the autumn, early grazing in the spring, or even winter grazing? So a variety of different pressures that can be on the system, whole different number of livestock types that we can use, and then a question of stocking rates both at the farm scale but also at the field scale, when we graze. So are we looking at set stocking type activity, continuous extensive, or various forms of rotational? I won't go into this in detail because John will be looking at this with a bit more focus, but we can rotate that grazing. We can vary it in terms of how long it is before we go back to each field or paddock, so short, medium and long grazing intervals. And then the frequency of livestock movement can be altered, how many livestock we have, how long they graze for, and how quickly they're moved on. Various other things we can also do in terms of managing the grassland. We can reseed, we can overseed, we can destroy the soil and start again, or we can rotivate and seed over the top to introduce new species. And there's variation in terms of how frequently we do that. We can use fertilizers and lime at various frequencies and amounts. And then and we can also add manure to the soil, different application rates, different types and different ways of spreading. We can also irrigate, and that may be a reflection of the European project that we're talking about, irrigation type and frequency there. We tend to more focus on drainage as being a big thing for us, very important for our heavy soils, grasslands on heavy soils. And then there's other forms of cultivation that we can do, including harrowing, but also sward lifting, which I'll get into. So that's just a bit about the management. In terms of the impacts of management, we talked about number of times we cut, how we graze, when we graze, and given that we have quite a lot of soils that are wet and of sort of poor drainage status, that can be a bit of a challenge in terms of maintaining those physical properties, physical health. So a lot of management pressures, particularly if we're looking to extend grazing into the winter. This can result in compaction at various levels. So we know that from the various research that's been done, that sheep tend to sort of cause that compaction in puddling the surface, so top few centimeters. With cattle, it can be down to 10 centimeters. And then with machinery, it can be much more sort of deep-seated compaction that we see and have to deal with. But what's the extent of that compaction, and what sort of condition are soils in? We did a survey about 10-15 years ago now, looking at various methods to assess soil condition. This is just one of the methods used, developed by Graham Shepherd from New Zealand, called visual soil assessment, which looks at soil structure and consistence, the porosity of the soil, the colour of the soil matrix, number and colour of soil mottles as an indication of drainage, but also compaction, earthworms appearing again in terms of the count, and then the surface relief. So there's these different visual indicators are part of the system, which each have their own multipliers, and then you add those scores up to give you a total VSA score. So if overall we've got a score less than 10, it's assessed as being in poor condition, 10 to 20 moderate, more than 20 is good. So this was done across 300 fields in England and Wales. Not only the VSA score, but the visual evaluation of soil structure score, earthworm counts and other things. But from that survey, we found that around about 10% of soils or fields that were investigated were in poor condition. And this was the same whether we looked at it from visual soil assessment technique or the visual evaluation of soil structure, the VEST technique. Around about 10% poor, around about half in moderate condition, and 30 to 40% in good condition. So that's what we're sort of dealing with. How do we avoid the compaction in the first place, or how do we mitigate the risk of poor soil condition, poor soil health, with that sort of physical condition feeding through to impacts on soil biology as well and overall health? Well, we can prevent that compaction in the first place just by thinking about when to graze, when the soils are particularly wet, the different parts of the farm. This is the sort of thing that farmers are doing on a day-to-day basis. They know their fields, they know which ones sit wet for longer and which ones can be grazed and how frequently. So a variety of methods to avoid that. And then in terms of machinery, it's thinking about when those soils are wet and particularly susceptible to compaction, compression, and smearing. But it's not always possible to avoid that if the grass has got to be cut or the livestock have got to be grazed for whatever reason. So if that severe compaction cannot be avoided, there may be other ways that farmers try to alleviate the compaction that occurs. So just a few thoughts on that in terms of what we can do. There are various options available to farmers through agri-environment schemes or capital grants, and under sustainable farming incentive. Things like herbal lays are one that can be used, and that's illustrated here in this slide. Here we've got a sort of spade full of soil showing some fairly clear compaction with sort of horizontal platey structure in a Halsworth series soils. That's a clay soil. And then a picture of a sward lifter trying to alleviate that compaction, which is often used when compaction is found. So it's a question of what the degree to which these different techniques can alleviate the compaction and change the soil properties, improve the soil health. And we did a bit of work under the Defra project BD 5001, which was looking at soil structural degradation and mitigation options. And at 4 sites across England and Wales, we introduced deep rooting herbs and legumes, but also did sward lifting at 2 different depths. And this slide illustrates the sward lifter, the typical setup for a sward lifter. There's just one type of machine, but they all have a similar setup in terms of having leading discs, the leg with a tine on it, and a packer roller behind to sort of push the sward back down again. So we were looking at that at 2 different depths alongside deep rooting herbs and legumes being overseeded, plus the 2 mitigation options in combination. And here are the results from that work. Just looking at the results from the medium textured soil sites. So three of the sites had fairly consistent results. Haven't presented the results for the deep rooting herbs and legumes here because they didn't have an observable or statistically significant effect on infiltration rate. So this is just looking at the infiltration rate effects on the sward lifting treatment. So we've got unloosened on the left-hand side for the 4 years after loosening, and we can see that we've got saturated infiltration rate on the y-axis, and then in the blue, which is for 2011, we can see compared to the unloosened treatment, dramatic increases in infiltration rate on the deeper loosened to around 35 centimeters depth, but also increases where it was shallower loosened. We see that effect also continues into 2012 and then is reduced in 2013 and 2014. So we have this dramatic increase in water infiltration rates, which is very useful from practical terms in terms of how that land can be managed, opportunities to graze or to carry out field operations. So a couple of years where we have higher infiltration rates, higher than is probably natural or normal, and then it returns to nearer sort of normal or lower infiltration rates. So that was the results we got as part of the BD 5001 project. We did something similar on a different soil type as part of the Super G project. So this was at Cockle Park in Northumberland, Newcastle University farm. Similar treatments, but this time we've got a control, one deep loosened treatment and a multi-species swards herbal ley treatment. And we could see that in the year following loosening and addition of the multi-species swards, we got this large increase in infiltration rates. But then by the following year, 2022, those infiltration rates are back to more or less where they were before, no difference between treatments. So in this case, we only saw the difference for that 1 year. Because 2022 or 2021 into 2022 was particularly wet, and returned the fields back to how they were before. So those are the effects on infiltration rates as an indicator of sort of drainage. So far so good, but we also as part of the BD 5001 project looked not only at the infiltration rates and yield effects, but also effects on deep burrowing earthworms or earthworms as a whole across the ecotype groups. And this was at one site, Nafferton, that we were able to do this, and it shows from the work that was done, this chart showing the mean number of anisic earthworms, so those are the deep burrowing earthworms, the effect of shallow loosening and deeper loosening in the 3 years following that loosening treatment. So compared to the unloosened, we see a reduction in the following year and in 2012. The second year, by 2014, no difference between the unloosened and shallow loosened, but deeper loosening still sort of lower than the unloosened treatment. So if we're thinking about earthworms being an important ecosystem engineer and doing good work for us, we need to bear in mind that the sward lifting treatment may, or looks like is impacting on these earthworms populations, even if it is only temporary, so worth bearing in mind. Probably need more work on this. It is one loosening application, one loosening event in one site. So it'll be useful to see if that's replicated elsewhere. Just to finish then, I'll just quickly go through some other work that we did as part of the Super G project, Sustainable Permanent Grasslands project. This was a systematic review led by René Schills at Wageningen, looking at permanent grasslands and comparing them against other land uses in terms of their ability to deliver multiple ecosystem services. So we looked at about 650 papers that covered this, different land use contrasts and different management contrasts. And the first conclusion that we came to as a result, I haven't got time to go into the detail, but it was clear that preventing the conversion of permanent grassland to cropland or temporary grassland or even forest secures the provision of multiple ecosystem services, because there were ecosystem services that permanent grasslands provide that those other land uses either cannot provide or don't provide in quite the same way. But then we looked at permanent grasslands themselves and how they're managed, and we looked at a whole range of different management contrasts in terms of how that management affects a range of indicators that indicate the range of ecosystem services. So for these three management contrasts, I only got time to have a look at 3 of them today. So looking at grassland renewal, increased defoliation frequency and nitrogen input, what were the effect of those on these different indicators. So for delivery of biodiversity, we're looking at pollinators, threatened species and plant richness. For greenhouse gas emissions or climate regulation, we're looking at nitrous oxide, methane and carbon dioxide emissions. Soil health quality, we're looking at carbon sequestration. For water quality, we're looking at nitrogen and phosphorus losses. And then for the food production service, yield, energy and protein. And for each of the management contrasts, if the dot is towards the outside of the donut in the green zone, then that management intervention has a favourable effect on the indicator and the service. If the dot's towards the middle in that redder zone, then the management intervention has an unfavourable effect on that indicator and service. So if we just look at the blue dots first of all in terms of grassland renewal, it's fairly clear that renewing the grassland has a favourable effect on increasing yield, but can impact on water quality and lead to loss of carbon and higher greenhouse gas emissions. See the blue dots towards the middle. If we're increasing the frequency of cutting and grazing, so that's the green dots, that can increase protein and energy in the grasslands, but decreases yield and can have a negative effect on pollinators, sort of threatened species, and botanical diversity. And then finally, nitrogen input, which is the red dots, clear benefits for yield and protein, but has impacts on the pollinators and the threatened species, botanical diversity, greenhouse gas emissions, and water quality. So if we're looking at a systematic review level, it's sort of clear that if we're looking for grasslands to deliver multifunctionality, multiple ecosystem services, we need to think about how they're managed and how we sort of incentivize farmers to sort of create those conditions to deliver that sort of multifunctionality. So just in summary then, soil is a living system. Important to remember the biology and how it interacts with the physical and the chemical. Soil health is vital for delivering essential soil ecosystem services. There are interacting, inherent and dynamic soil properties which determine the ability to deliver those ecosystem services. Dynamic soil properties are determined by the land management. We can alter the inherent properties to a degree, and dynamic soil properties to a sort of greater extent. There are multiple challenges and options with managing grasslands, all sorts of things that we can do. In terms of condition, we think around 10% of grassland soils are in poor condition from a survey about 10 years ago, but there'll be new information coming through via the Natural Capital Ecosystem Assessment surveys. We really need to try and manage grasslands to avoid the severe compaction, but there are sometimes challenges in doing this. And I would suggest only use the mechanical alleviation, sward lifting type techniques as a last resort where we really have that severe compaction affecting drainage and sort of farm performance. We need farming systems that are resilient and adaptive and contribute to sustainability at all scales, field, farm, catchment, national and global. And then finally, temporary and permanent grasslands could play an increasingly important role in sustainable agricultural systems, adapting to climate change and delivering multifunctionality. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Paul. Just a reminder to everyone that we'll be taking questions at the end of the next presentation. So if you have a question, please submit it via the questions box by 12:50. I'd now like to introduce you to our second presenter, John Langley-Randall. John's a soil scientist at ADAS, having joined the Soils and Nutrients team in 2022. Since joining ADAS, John has been working on a range of projects, including the Super-G project that Paul mentioned in his presentation, as well as reviewing the potential of biochar in UK agriculture and evaluating on-farm implementation of the sustainable farming incentive schemes. Before joining ADAS, John completed his PhD at Bangor University, which assessed the impact of slurry acidification on soil and crop health through UK field trials. So John's going to talk to us about the results of a Natural England funded project, which compared the impact of mob and conventional grazing on soil chemical, biological and physical indicators, as well as outlining a multi-year Defra funded mob grazing project currently undertaken by an ADAS-led consortium of project partners. So over to you, John.
Great, thanks, Lizzie, and thanks, Paul, for introducing where we are with grassland management. So yeah, as Lizzie said, I'm going to be talking through the impacts of mob grazing on soil health. So just as a brief starting point, I'm going to outline the types of grazing systems that are typically found within the UK before moving on to the results and the methodologies used in a Natural England funded study, and starting to introduce the mob grazing study, the Defra funded one, which is still ongoing at the moment. So in the UK landscape, key factors that characterise the grazing systems. So a lot of it's dependent on levels of stocking intensity, frequency of livestock movements, the length of the rest period between grazing events, and the pre and post grazing grass covers. So typically effectively the length of grass that livestock enters and leaves the field at, as well as the impact of grazing management. And I'll go into this in a little bit more detail over the next couple of slides, but in general, there's a bit of a sliding scale between livestock intensity and movements between what would be found and classed as a set stock system compared to the other extreme, which is a mob grazing system. So just to outline in a bit more detail, a continuous set stock grazing system. This is typically where livestock are turned out into a field or a number of fields with open gates and effectively left there for what can be up to the entire grazing period or season. There's relatively little demand in terms of management, and it can lead to potentially preferred grazing, so increases the risk of weed species developing within the grassland, but also requires less management time by the farmer, and also once the infrastructure is in place, typically gateways and water, the infrastructure's there and is a relatively easy system to manage. The next step towards what we classed as a mob grazing system is rotational grazing, where the grazing density is typically increased ever so slightly, and there's a movement of cattle, but they still have access to quite wide grazing areas, so typically field level or potentially between two fields with an open gateway, but then gateways get closed and they get excluded from certain areas to extend that rest period between grazing events. Next is where we see a little bit of subdivision entering in to a grazing system. So here is on screen is an example where grazing levels are increased, so the actual density of the livestock themselves are increased and have a more strict rotation around subdivided fields. And again, the grazing period is reduced in each cell and the rest period is increased. And then finally, in terms of management, the opposite end of the spectrum to set stocking is mob grazing. We'll go into this a little bit more in more detail in terms of what mob grazing is and the fact that it's quite difficult to define, but it tends to be characterized by high density grazing. So fields get subdivided into quite small parcels. The livestock get grazed for, it can be, depending on the livestock, it can be a matter of hours up to a couple of days, and they get grazed in that area for a short period of time, but then moved on very, very quickly. So it has a longer grass recovery period, and they typically graze higher grass covers, so they tend to go in with more standing vegetation. This can add management time on for farmers because they have to move the livestock on regularly. So like I said, potentially once or twice a day, depending on the system, or every other day. Some farmers say that's quite good because they get to watch the livestock moving, so can reduce vet call-outs by being able to identify issues earlier, but also the system relies on more infrastructure inputs, typically temporary fencing and especially water provision. So in the mob grazing system, literature is starting to emerge and is starting to become a little bit more common in the UK, generally due to the perceived benefits that are listed on the screen now. So these are all perceived at the moment. There's thought to be greater pasture productivity, and like I mentioned, when there's a longer rest period between grazing events, there's the opportunity for greater photosynthesis and increased productivity that way. And it also shifts the sward composition towards taller grass species. As there's a high intensity grazing events occurring, due to the stocking density over a short period of time, it reduces the risk of preferred grazing. So the livestock effectively have to eat what's in front of them, so there's potential reduced buildup of weed species. Due to the livestock not going back to the fields or the area of the cells, it can break the parasite life cycle. And so we're going to look in a bit more detail for the Natural England study especially, is the potential to improve soil health and carbon sequestration. And this is due to increased biomass returning to soil following trampling due to the higher density of livestock and a more even distribution of feces and urine into each cell. And then also the longer rest period between grazing events is perceived to increase and promote root growth. So that sets the scene where we are in grazing and outlines some of the perceived benefits of mob grazing. So I'm now going to talk about the Natural England study, which looked at mob grazing. This was completed over a year ago now. And the main aim of this was simply to assess the impact of mob grazing on soil health, and this was going to be compared to conventional grazing, so set stocked or semi-rotational grazing using a paired farm approach. So to get farmers involved, we set up an online expression of interest form, which was circulated within existing ADAS and Natural England networks. And this was very much just a question to see what farmers have on farms. So outline the type of grazing management and grassland. So quite simply, do you identify yourself as mob grazing, or and what kind of what type of livestock that you actually graze, age, sward, and soil type, before using that initial online of expression to identify potential or suitable pairs of farms. And these were either on the same farm, these pairs to reduce the difference between soil type and climate, or we asked farmers if they didn't have any of the alternative grazing methods. So typically we would identify the mob grazers first, and if they had areas of conventional grazing on the farm, we would use that as a comparison. And if they didn't, we would ask them to nominate a neighbour for them to contact us, and that's how we would find that paired farm approach. And we would ask for the field as close to the mob grazing field as possible to act as the comparison. So in this detailed questionnaire phone survey, we asked outline information on length of time in grass, the fertilizer use, grazing duration, number of livestock, all information that we will need to look at helping to explain any changes that we found during the field work. So so going back to the other methods that we used fairly typical methods to identify changes in soil physical, chemical, and biological properties. So, as Paul mentioned earlier, we used the VES method to look at soil structure. We did earthworm counts, looked at soil bulk density, soil chemistry, a whole host of the nutrients that you typically find, soil organic carbon, and also looked at some of the respiration rates as well as to support the earthworm numbers in soil biology. So we'll move on to the results now. So we found those 24 pairs of sites. The map on the right-hand side of the screen, as you're looking at it, identifies where the sites were distributed around the UK. So we feel we got a good representation of different areas and different climate and soil types. We tried to match the livestock types, the types of grazing, as closely as possible. You can see dairy and suckler were matched like for like in the pairs, although with the beef and rearing, we had slightly more rearing and finishing on the mob grazing and slightly more sheep in the conventional grazing. That was just to in terms of pairing up the fields. Importantly, though, I think it's the bottom table on the screen there really highlights the relatively new nature of mob grazing within UK agriculture. So the majority of the farms that we included in the study were up to 5 years old with mob grazing, and very few were in that top bracket of over 10. Whereas if you look at the conventional side of things, that the majority is a reverse effectively. So the majority of the farms were over 10 years old, and quite a lot of those were like substantially exceeded 10 years old. When I was asking the questions, quite a lot of the farms said they've been in that type of grazing management for forever, was the response that I got. So we had to classify it somehow. So we just broke it down in these groups. As part of the farmer survey, I think it was interesting to notice the stocking density on the left-hand side. So just to break down this graph, so the top 3 panels, stocking density, intensity, and typical rest period, that's for mob grazing, and then the bottom 3 left to right there for conventional set stocked or some kind of loose rotational grazing. And we can see, we'll start off with stocking density. So the one furthest on the left, there was an order of magnitude difference between what was found in conventional and what was found in mob grazing. So typical stocking density was around about 10 livestock units per hectare for conventional grazing, whereas it was upwards of 100. And there was also for mob grazing, and there was also a clear division between types of livestock that were grazing. So dairy was typically found to be at a higher livestock density. You can see that in the top orange circle that I've put on the graph, though, as the sheep tended to be slightly lower, which wasn't found in set stock grazing. But then once we kind of normalize that data, so multiply the livestock units by the number of grazing days, we can see it kind of brings the two systems slightly closer together. There was a bigger range in conventional grazing. And then importantly, as part of the system for mob grazing, as I outlined at the start, was the typical rest period in mob grazing systems was higher. It was about twice as high as it was for conventional systems. So a lot of mob grazing evidence has come over from the USA, and just to put it into a bit of context, that the livestock density can be, on average, based on one paper survey that I found, was about 400 livestock units per hectare. So we're still slightly less than what's typical in the mob grazing systems in the US, but again, it's clear that the stocking density is much higher than the conventional. Stocking density was similar, as I mentioned. Rest period was greater. And although the data isn't shown here, mob grazers typically had set targets for pre and post cover length, so the height of the sward that the livestock was going into, but there wasn't much difference between fertilizer use between the systems. A significant impact of mob grazing, or the perceived benefits of, is the increase in soil carbon. So we would have expected these graphs to effectively show the other way around. So what we found was that conventional grazing had a significantly higher carbon stock in the top 15 centimetres, which continued as a numerical difference, but not significant statistical difference throughout the 15 to 30 centimetres, and then when it was combined to show the whole top 30 centimetres profile. And we think this could be a relic of the fact that mob grazing systems have had a recent management change, which can affect soil carbon. Whereas, as I mentioned earlier, the length of time in conventional grazing set stock systems was a much longer, so that could be one reason for this these results, and it will probably rely on potentially returned visits as time goes by to some of these fields, if possible, to see if there are any changes as a result of the mob grazing. And then, interestingly, we found that there were significant differences in soil biology. So this is earthworm number and biomass, and the cells highlighted in yellow show a significant increase in earthworm numbers and biomass, and that's largely driven by juveniles and endogeic. And it was initially supposed that obviously the return of vegetation through the trampling of mob grazing could be a reason for this increase, but we think due to the no significant difference between the soil respiration, that this is unlikely to be the case, and may be a result of disturbance, that if the livestock are in set stocked or semi-rotational fields for longer, it may disturb the life cycle of the worms, whereas if there's longer rest periods, that could be a reason for the increased figures that we find here. So that's a quick overview of the Natural England project, and I'll briefly introduce the mob grazing impacts, benefits and trade-offs, which is the Defra-funded project. This is an ongoing project to assess the practical, economic and environmental implications of mob grazing systems. We're partway through the field work, which is due to end this year before best practice guidance can be released next year. But we have completed the survey of grazing practices in the UK and a rapid evidence assessment. So this is led by ADAS, but we are working with Newcastle University, Liz Genevieve, AFBI, Bangor University and LRM Vets, and we will be looking at various in-field measures, so soil quality, environmental emissions, biodiversity and livestock performance across 9 sites for the field work. So just to outline the survey, we've got a lot of information which is at peer review at the moment, so we hope to be able to share that with you soon. But the online survey, that initially looked at 231 respondents, which looked at all livestock types. So the map on the right-hand side shows you the livestock enterprises and the distribution of the respondents. So it was good mix across the UK, and then we honed this into a bit more detailed phone interview. So 66 of these explored socio-economic drivers, enablers and barriers to mob grazing and rotational grazing. That was carried out and is, like I said, is being reviewed by Defra currently. This led on to the rapid evidence assessment, which is effectively a literature review with quite strict search terms. And I won't go through those, but it was in detail for the primary research questions, but you can read them on the screen. But it was to do with the environmental impacts, productivity and profitability impacts, and the impacts on rotational grazing on animal health and welfare. And this was all from published literature. So just to pick out one aspect of it to do with soil health, this is a bit of an overview of the impact of mob grazing on soil organic matter, and we can see that we're looking at a low number of papers that have reported on mob grazing impact on soil organic matter in general. So we've got 5 papers where it's compared to continuous grazing, and a handful of papers where it's compared to rotational grazing. It is important to note here that since this REA was completed, other literature has come out which isn't covered here, such as the Lisa Norton paper, and I think Rothamsted have also looked at mob grazing as well, but those papers aren't included in this REA due to the timing of it. But overall, there was deemed to be insufficient independent scientific research to provide a robust evidence base to assess the impact of mob grazing systems on ecosystem service delivery, grassland productivity or animal health, especially under temperate climatic conditions. So that leads into the field work that has been undergoing for a couple of years now. So this is to investigate the impacts, benefits and trade-offs of a mob grazing system compared to a conventional set stock semi-rotational grazing system. And this is within commercial farm sites. And this is really to provide evidence on impacts of mob grazing for UK farms over multiple grazing seasons. So the field work, it was carried out on, and it is still being carried out on commercial farm sites. Each site, each farm effectively will compare 2 grazing systems. So part of the grazing platform will be set aside for the conventional control, which was set stocked or semi-rotational system. And then mob grazing was also carried out nearby to contrast and see what those differences were. In terms of experimental design, it was a split field design, so fields are split between control and mob grazing. And at the start of each season, cattle were allocated to the control and mob grazing to make it balanced in terms of livestock. Across England and Wales, we've got 9 sites. Most of these all, they all had cattle, a mixture of beef and dairy. And we also had 1 site in Wales, which is the Gillingham-Clevedon site, number 9, which also had sheep as part of the platform as well. So this work is ongoing, and hopefully we'll have some more data in the next year or 2 in terms of results for this site. But in terms of overall conclusions for the impact of mob grazing on soil health, overall we found that it was quite difficult to actually define what mob grazing is, especially as it's used interchangeably with other terms, so cell grazing, but it's generally around the basic principles of having longer pre and post grazing covers, quite small grazing areas, but more regular movements, and typically greater stocking density. And then in terms of results from the Natural England study that I just presented, earthworm numbers and biomass were significantly higher in mob grazed systems, but there's very little difference in soil chemistry and soil physical condition. Surprisingly, soil organic carbon was greater in conventional topsoils, but that needs to be caveated with the fact that most mob grazing sites in the study have been in that system for less than 5 years, whereas the conventional grazing was much longer than that. And that's important to highlight that the changes in soil chemistry are likely to take a number of years to actually become detectable. That's my slide. So thanks very much for listening, and I hope you found it useful. And I suppose, if there's any questions, I suppose we'll go into that question session now.
That's great. Thanks, John. We now come to the Q&A section of the webinar, so I think Paul will join us back on screen as well. So we've got a couple of questions in the chat. I'm going to start with one for you, Paul. Given that the projects didn't improve infiltration rates over time, so you only got a short improvement for a short period, what did you conclude about the tools you chose to try and reduce compaction?
Okay, yes, I mean the limited amount of time that those higher infiltration rates are sustained for, I mean it's a bit of an issue, and it's a bit of a quandary for the farmer land manager really, because where they do have compaction and significant drainage problems, it does restrict them in terms of when they can access the land and when they can graze, and that can have a significant impact on the business in terms of housing costs and having to feed indoors and manage the manures and slurries that are produced when the stock are indoors. So a lot of people do feel that the sward lifting is really useful and helps them to improve the drainage of those fields. But it's not a simple solution, because you have to be very careful. First of all, that you've got severe compaction, because if you're doing it when your soils are in good condition, then you're likely to do more harm than good. You're better off not doing it. But also you need to do it in the right conditions. So I mean, the ideal conditions for sward lifting are really having a bit of moisture on the top in the sward, so you don't tear the sward as the discs and tines go in, and then it needs to be drier lower down where the tines are working, so that you're actually shattering rather than smearing at that working depth. So all these things are very important. And then once it's been lifted, the land is quite sensitive to recompaction. So you don't want to be going back on with machinery for a few months. I mean, the recommendation is to be light grazing, preferably with sheep, over that following winter, before you'd go back in with cattle in the spring, or sort of heavy machinery the following sort of spring, early summer. But having said that, it does improve conditions for 3 or 4 years, and then it would be a question of reassessing. Because if you're managing the land well after that, then there's no reason why you couldn't sustain sort of better infiltration rates than they were previously. They might not be as high as the 2 or 3 years following lifting, but they could be better than they were before you sward lifted. Sorry, I rambled a bit, but that's my answer.
Thank you. We'll have one more to you, Paul, before I come to John. Leah's answer is asked, she said that she was curious if there was a relationship between earthworms, soil infiltration with grass species, root architecture, and grass species diversity.
Yeah, no, we didn't see that relationship. I mean, other studies may have looked at that, but in terms of the relationship between grassland plant species diversity and infiltration, we didn't see that. I mean, that study, particularly the experimental work, we were manipulating the species diversity by overseeding, and so we had greater diversity as a result of that overseeding, and that didn't result in higher infiltration rates, which was what we were hoping for, but it didn't result in that. We also concluded from the other parts of that project that there didn't seem to be a strong relationship between the species diversity and soil compaction as a whole. So soil compaction didn't necessarily seem to be a limitation in terms of achieving greater diversity in swards. But yeah, it's an interesting area, and the whole idea about root architecture being a factor is interesting. We did see that through the sward lifting, okay, back to the metal again, but through the sward lifting we were able to improve root architecture and root depth, post sward lifting. So that was interesting. I mean, difficult to sort of relate that through to function, but yeah, it did result in deeper roots.
Okay, thank you. We are coming up to time. I'm just gonna there's a couple of questions for John, and then we'll wrap up. So John, first one's a quick one. You mentioned about pasture productivity. How do you define pasture productivity?
So it's typically yields and how much livestock, you can graze on it. So it's fairly straightforward.
Okay. Another question for you, John. What are your thoughts on what grassland species are more suitable for mob grazing practices?
So there has been a little bit of research on species, and you can lose herb species due to the longer nature of the vegetation when you go in. So some grassy species do tend to fare better.
Okay. You answered that quite quickly. So there's just one other quick one here that I'll ask as well. Someone was asking specifically about the survey and how we analyse the data, specifically what type of software was used to analyse the data.
So that was, I just used R, and then I used statistical packages within R to try and use use linear mixed models to see if there were any differences between the data.
Okay, thank you. So we're now just coming up to the end of the hour. So apologise if we didn't get to your questions. I can see that Paul's answered some of those directly to the people that posed them. But I'll now draw the session to an end. So on behalf of the British Society of Soil Science, I'd like to express our thanks to both Paul and John for coming along to present today. And thanks to all of you for attending. You will find a quick feedback survey when you leave the webinar, which we'll hope you'll take the time to complete. The recording of the webinar will also be available after the event on our YouTube channel. Just a quick reminder that today's presentation has also been awarded BASIS and Neroso points. So if you're registered with either body, please send your details to us after the event. So you can email to admin@soils.org.uk. So our next webinar is provisionally scheduled for Wednesday, the 5th of March, and we hope it'll be on outreach and science. So keep an eye on our website to find out how to register. So I hope to see you at future events. And in the meantime, thank you again and goodbye.